We are interviewing Barbara Shepherd for the West Volusia Historical Society, and today's date is March 31st, 2025, and we're in DeLand House, and the interviewer is Kathy Hirsch. Tell us a bit about your background, where you were born and raised.
Okay. My husband Jeff Shepherd and I were both born in Kokomo, Indiana. It's about 50 miles straight north of Indianapolis. Kokomo is largely a factory town, and when Jeff and I were 21, I think we were, maybe 22, we decided that if we stayed in Kokomo, we would end up with one of these great paying factory jobs and retire from that, and that would be our life. And we thought, surely there's more. So we hit the road. We decided we would just jump in a car that we bought that was a station wagon that we could sleep in, and Jeff's desire was to be a saxophonist and my desire was to be a writer. And we would head east from Kokomo to the coast and work our way down the coast and find our dream. And that journey, we had stopped in Ormond Beach where my brother was living. We stopped at a lot of places and had a lot of wonderful adventures on that trip. But when we found DeLand from Ormond Beach, because you could come to DeLand and pick oranges for, I think it was $5 a bin or whatever it was. So that's what we did for money, in addition to selling plasma. And we found DeLand that way. And when we drove over here from Ormond Beach with the car windows down, because of course we didn't have air conditioning in the car, the smell of the orange blossoms. And lo and behold, in DeLand, I got a job at the DeLand Sun News, and Jeff worked at actually a factory out at the airport, RAF Magnetics, but he could go at night and play saxophone at the Cypress Room in the Hotel Putnam. So DeLand stuck with us, and here we are, still here.
Tell the story about how you went from paste up to editorial side.
Right. When I got my job then at the Sun News, which I want to tell a little story about that because it was a paste up job, which today we would call it graphic artist. But back then it was pretty manual with an X-Acto knife, nothing really on the computer. So I went in for the interview, and the gentleman who interviewed me, he said, okay, thank you very much, I'll call you, or I'll call your references and get back with you. And I said, I was, 22 years old, fresh and newcomer to DeLand. And I sat in that chair and I said, why don't you call my references right now? And he did. And he came back 15 or 20 minutes later and he said, you've got the job. I guess I kind of had confidence in my references because I'd done this paste up work before when I lived in Indianapolis. So I started work there at the Sun News. And what did you ask me to tell?
How you got to the editorial.
Right. And so we actually pasted up the newspaper pages. We used wax on the back of this special film that came out of a computer machine, very different from what we do today. And I wrote a letter to the editor of the Sun News. And the editor came back from the newsroom into the paste up room and he said, did you really write this letter? And I said, well, yes, of course I did. And he said, well, come on, I want you to work in the newsroom. And so I started out by just typing things. And it was great training. I got to type obituaries, which, by the way, were hand carried to the newspaper office on paper by the funeral home directors. And then we would take the piece of paper and put that in the system. And so little by little, I got to work on the women's news page, which was a page in the paper actually called Women's News, and got to know all the wonderful women in DeLand who were part of the clubs and organizations, and progressed from there into covering the DeLand City Commission, crime news, things like that, and eventually ended up as, I think they called me associate editor. So that meant I got to come in on Saturday and put the weekend edition together.
So how many years was it?
I worked at the Sun News for 10 years, and it was, you kind of had the feeling of being a bit on a sinking ship. I mean, it wasn't the same problems that plague local newspapers today, but it's always been, I think, a hard business. And so I started kind of casting about and got on as a freelancer for the Orlando Sentinel. And I had little babies by then, and I used to bring them with me to the Sentinel office, was right here on New York Avenue. And I'd stick them under the desk and type my stories in, and I got to work for Bo Portner. I don't know if you've ever met him, but a wonderful editor. I learned an awful lot from him, and the day that the Orlando Sentinel came out, and I usually wrote for a inside section that they called West Volusia News or whatever they called it, feature stories. But somehow, one time, I think I got to write a actual hard news story that got in the actual local section. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I just loved the Sentinel as a newspaper so much back then.
You remember what that story was?
I think I do, but I don't want to trust my memory. It was a local tragedy, actually. I think it was a murder, but I don't remember details. We could look it up, probably.
Murders were probably very rare in DeLand at that time, in Volusia County.
Probably, yeah. Although, so I worked for the Sentinel for about 2 years, and during that time, the Daytona Beach News Journal had purchased the Sun News and ran it for exactly 365 days and shut it down with an announcement in the final edition that, don't worry, we'll have your West Volusia news in our Daytona Beach newspaper. And we thought, no. West Volusia, especially then, more so than now, I think, was very distinct from East Volusia. We just had different concerns. We were more rural. We were politically more conservative, and needed our own local newspaper that was locally owned and wasn't beholden to any interests, whatever they might be, of out-of-towners or East Siders, we called them. So over a period, the last edition of the Sun News hit my front porch on June 30th, 1992. And a man named Bruce Pratt, boy, Bruce, I hope I've got your name right, pretty sure that's correct. He worked for the circus, and he came to me, and he came to my neighbor, Eileen Everett, and he said, guys, you've got the skills, please start a local newspaper. And so we had children about the same age and knew each other a little bit, not super well, and started talking about it. And I'm sure Bruce probably came to us maybe in July, and by September, we decided that we could do it and that we would take the plunge and start a local newspaper.
That was a big decision.
Yeah, my husband didn't think so at the time. He thought we were very foolish. But we attended some SBA seminars that were, as I recall, on the Stetson campus, and learned a little bit about
SBA would be Small Business Association?
Right, Small Business Administration. I remember so distinctly the gentleman telling us, the whole class, when you own a business, it's 24/7. You will think about it, work it, eat, sleep, and breathe it. And I remember that, thinking hard about that. He was right, of course. But we went ahead and did it anyway, even though we had small children and zero money. So Eileen had a master's degree in journalism, and I had all the experience that we needed. And, but we didn't have money, And we also didn't have anybody who was really a business mind, you know, the money, the tax reports, and all those things. So those were, so we set about, I knew a good newspaper business manager, a financial person. That was Joann Kramer, who I'd worked with at the Sun News. She was the CFO, more or less, of the Sun News. And she had actually stayed on with the News Journal company. So I went to visit her at her office at the News Journal. I love this story. And under the premise that I had some sort of question about my Sun News retirement account. And I got into her office, closed the door, and I said, Joann, this other lady and I are going to start a newspaper. We're wondering if you would work for us. She took about 30 seconds and she said, no, I won't work for you, but I will go into partnership with you. So that was that problem solved. Joann knew everything about the business end of a newspaper. So that was good. And then I stopped by Roger Gilmore's house. And people will remember Roger Gilmore, who since 1959 had been chronicling local sports in the DeLand area. Beloved by many and missed since the Sun News was gone. He was no longer writing. Knocked on his door, and I think he might have taken 5 or 10 seconds to say, when's the first deadline? Didn't want any money, didn't care about anything except being able to do what he knew was so important to the young people to get their name in the paper. So there we went. That was us in the beginning. And we realized that we were really going to need somebody to sell advertising because that's how newspapers make their way. And Eileen, because she's just braver and more generous than me, offered to be the first advertising salesperson. And the idea was that we would swap. You know, she would sell ads for a year and I would write stories and then we would trade. And I'm sorry to say that we never traded. By the time it was time to trade, we had found another advertising salesperson. So that's how it went, in fits and starts. And Joann and Eileen and I forgot to tell you that at the beginning, we thought we'd better have some money, some capitalization. So the three of us, the three women, and then we were also advised that we'll need a board of directors that has men on it, because nobody in town would be investing in a company that just had 3 women. So we went around to visit with some prominent people in DeLand that we thought might have money or interest in a local newspaper. And it just became really obvious that if that's the direction we went in, what they really wanted was control of the content and the newspaper's viewpoint. And we just weren't going to do that. So we decided that if we could each put in $1,000, we could make it work. And that's what we did, except I didn't have $1,000. So I just offered to work extra. So with $2,000, and then we consulted with Sidney Taylor, I don't know, longtime DeLand attorney and known as the champion of DeLand's status as the county seat, long involved in the community. Went and talked with him, and he went out and recruited, I want to say 6 or 7 DeLand families to each give $1,000 and buy stock in our little corporation. We found Astrid DePerry. After talking with a few male attorneys, we found Astrid DePerry, who would happily do all our required legal work in exchange for stock in the company. And there we were. We incorporated, I want to say on November 5th, 1992, and launched our first edition at the DeLand Christmas Parade. And we borrowed somebody's van, and covered it with sheets of paper that spelled out, "Yes, Virginia, DeLand does have a local newspaper again." And we managed somehow to have the money to have 5,000 copies printed, recruited every spouse and sibling and whoever we could find, and walked down the boulevard, alongside that van and passed out free copies of our first edition with a little flyer inside about how you could subscribe. And I think by January of '93, we had more than 1,000 subscribers. So it was obviously something the community really embraced and wanted. And Kathy Sanders Realty was our first advertiser. She took a big old half-page ad. Very grateful for that. And we were off.
And what about editorial content about recruiting reporters and things like that?
Well, it was a while before we could really afford anyone other than, I'm trying to remember, our first reporter might have been Grace Kaiser. I'm not sure. But, it was a weekly paper, so we had an entire week to get content together. And I'm pretty capable at that, at least I used to be. So we would do that, and I'm sure Eileen chipped in, and then you can usually find somebody who wants to write opinion pieces for you. And in our case, we found a man named Phil Buford. He's gone now, but he wrote a very controversial, and which makes it wonderful, column for the Beacon for a long time. Community members. I tell people all the time, we're a community paper, and that means that you work here too. Now turn that thing in. Turn in that story. It's been a wonderful, wonderful run, and now it's 32 years. Is it almost ready to be 33, isn't it? So, and the Beacon is still, we're very proud that the Beacon is still here and doing okay. I mean, we're at the point where we're asking for donations from the community. Costs are escalating, and it's a big challenge to keep it profitable.
Do you still have the feeling that the community supports the paper?
I often say the honeymoon is over, and I think a lot of people, how fast we grow and how many newcomers there are, and many people who live in West Volusia today don't remember that we did actually lose our local newspaper for a little while. But yes, people love the Beacon. That is the word they use. I love the Beacon, and we appreciate every subscriber so much.
It sounds like that you really understood the community.
Well, I'd been covering it, local news, for 10 years. And Eileen was very involved. She was an adjunct at Stetson University and member of St. Peter Catholic Church, and was also very involved in the community. Her husband, Dave Everett, was the number 2 librarian at Stetson. So that's, I think, what brought them here. It was a very lucky coincidence that, that we got it together and started the paper.
And you knew which doors to knock on.
We did, yeah. And after knocking on a few, decided to just do it ourselves.
And about the board of directors, did you ever resolve that?
You mean the male board of directors? Well, we did put together a board of directors, and I don't really remember in total. I think the 3 of us were on it. I remember Alex Ford served on our board for many years and much appreciated, but I don't think I can fully remember. It's written down somewhere, I'm sure.
Tell us about the move into the Conrad properties.
Yeah.
How that came about.
Yeah, okay. So we started out on Indiana Avenue in the back of what was Attorney Jose Alvarez's office. It's now a chiropractic office on Indiana Avenue. So we were in 2 rooms and then 3 rooms, and maybe we even took over a 4th room. Grew out of that and moved over onto Wisconsin Avenue, into a 1904, 1905 wooden house and actually helped renovate it to the degree that we could run a newspaper in there. But we were growing out of that too. We were having thousands of copies of the paper delivered and had to process those for mailing, and it just became unworkable. I say we were sitting on each other's laps to get the job done. And it was 121 West Wisconsin Avenue. It's right about where the swimming pool for the Marriott is now. And we told our board of directors, we've got to have a bigger place. And it might be time, we were successful then, it might be time for us to buy something. And the board was of the opinion that we needed to stay in downtown DeLand, the seat of government, So we started looking for property to buy, to move the newspaper in, and it was not a lot for sale that would accommodate our needs. But there was an acre of buildings, 3 buildings at the time, for sale on West New York Avenue in the 100 block, commonly called the Conrad property. And we looked at it, and we thought we probably needed maybe 3,000 square feet to operate properly. And the Conrad building was 45,000 square feet. So it quite exceeded what we needed, but it was an intriguing property. And the deal was, if you bought the real estate, the price was $850,000. No, I'm sorry. If you bought the real estate, the price was $1.3 million. And if you bought the company, Conrad Realty Company, the price was $850,000, because by selling the company, the stockholders then would not have capital gains. So since we had $0, we thought the lower price sounded good. And we went to Dick Reynolds at First Community Bank, a locally owned bank, and he was such a believer in the value of the West Volusia Beacon newspaper that he agreed to loan us not just the purchase price of $850,000, but to loan us $875,000 so that we could immediately have 2 of the buildings tinted for termites. It was said in DeLand at the time, so this was 2004, that the only reason the Conrad buildings were still standing was that the termites were holding hands. So off we go into this new adventure. So First Community Bank gave us more than 100% financing. And the place, I hate to say it now, but it had been neglected. Burl Coffin was in charge when we took over. And Burl's a wonderful guy, but he said the upper floor where is a beautiful thing now, but at the time was just empty. And Burl said, yeah, if I get a tenant, I have to clean the restrooms every day. So he didn't really want to be bothered with tenants, but he was there. There were, I think, maybe 8 tenants. A lot of them were for storage, and we had a court reporter, Fred Fint, the attorney, and Plexus, which was a uniform supplier to police and fire departments and so on. So very few tenants. When we started out, the monthly mortgage payment was $6,395 a month, and our rental income at the time was $5,800 a month. So that cost me a little sleep, but not for very long. We quickly found people in the community who were interested in investing again in this new corporation that was going to restore the Conrad property, and that's how that adventure all started. But I think you asked me about the Beacon's move. So we actually closed on the purchase of the property in December 2004, and the Beacon moved into the space we still occupy at 110 West New York in March of 2005. And it was 6,000 square feet. Oh, it was wonderful. Everybody could have their own little area, and when the newspapers came back to the shop from the printer, we had plenty of room to spread them around and get them ready for the mailing, and so that was wonderful. And then it was a matter of doing what we could when we had a little bit of money and getting new tenants and filling the place up. And that has been my distraction for the last 22 or so years, and it's just been a wonderful opportunity. I have had the chance to see so many spirited entrepreneurs take space in there and watch how hard they work to make their businesses succeed. It's a daily inspiration. And the Beacon was the same way. We also were working on keeping the newspaper successful in our fancy new space.
Tell us about how you discovered there were bats in the building.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was always something. Something was always breaking, and I needed a lot of friends who had owned 100-year-old buildings before. I certainly never had. And one of my good friends was Mark Shuttleworth over on Georgia Avenue with his business, Florida Victorian Architectural Antiques. So one day I was wandering the sidewalk in front of the Beacon, and I noticed these little black things on the sidewalk. And I looked up at the building and I thought, what is going on now? What is this? So I went to get Mark, and he came to look at my little black things, and he said, Barb, that looks an awful lot like what's under my bat house at our home in Lake Helen. He said, I think you better come out here at dusk and watch the top of the building and see what you can see. So that's what we did. We went out at dusk and saw hundreds of bats flying out of a breach in the tile roof at the top of the building. I knew nothing about bats. I didn't know what to do about this or anything. Started casting around and found a nonprofit organization, which is essentially a couple, Laura and Tom Finn, but they have a nonprofit organization called Fly by Night. They're based in Osteen, and they came right up and helped us diagnose this problem, and estimated that we had a colony of 2,000 bats in the attic of the Beacon building. And it was May, and from May to September, roughly, you are not allowed to disturb bats. They are federally protected. They're very important, essential to our ecology, just like bees and monarch butterflies. So we had to just live with them, find a way to live with them until September 15th, I think, was the date that we could take action. So my husband Jeff and our handyman, George Sword, couldn't have done the whole thing without him. They would go up in the attic weekly and clean up the guano, which is the polite term for bat excrement. And it was kind of a good thing that I didn't have a lot of tenants on the second floor at that time. Attorney Tanner Andrews was there, but he's a pretty tolerant man. So we just made it work until September, and with the advice of Tom and Laura, we couldn't afford to actually hire them to do the work, but we were able to exclude the bats, which is a process. It's pretty simple, but you make it possible for the bats to exit the building, but not possible for them to return home, because they pretty much have to land, and then they turn themselves upside down and climb up into wherever they're going to be home. And so I thought, well, we're going to do this, and we did. And as I recall, we got the exclusion materials in place on Friday, and then Jeff and I came down to check. They said we should come down and check and make sure that the bats weren't able to get back in. So we came down to check it very, very early in the morning, 5:30 or something like that. And all these bats, I mean, it was like a cloud of bats circling around and trying to get back in. It just broke my heart. And I called Tom Finn of Fly By Night, even though it was 5:30 in the morning. I said, Tom, I can't do this. We've got to let them go home. And he said, Barb, it'll be okay. They'll find other places to go. Just take a few minutes, just take a deep breath. And sure enough, by about, I forget, 7 a.m., there was not a bat to be seen in the sky. But I thought the kind thing to do would be to put up some alternative housing. So that's how we got our first bat house. And Tom and Laura installed it. And it took the bats a full year to occupy it, to trust me enough again. And the bats have just been a delight. For one thing, when you come to Artisan Alley now of an evening, you will not be bitten by mosquitoes. And they take care of all the mosquitoes for us, and they leave us alone. People are afraid of bats, but the last thing a bat wants is to interact with you. They just want to leave the bat house, go fly somewhere, and eat bugs all night. So we're very grateful that the bats have decided to stay. And I think it was probably 7 years later, or maybe 5, that I put up a second bat house. I could tell that the first one was getting pretty full. So the bats have been a great tourist attraction. You can look out on the Conrad courtyard of an evening, and people have even brought their own chairs, and they're sitting out there waiting to watch the bat fly out.
So in addition to your many other accomplishments, you're a bat expert.
Well, I do know some things about it. I've had to learn. Because what do you do when you find one crawling on the ground? And let me just insert this for anybody who might be watching. There's a lot of talk about bats having rabies. And yes, about 1% of a bat colony on average does have rabies. But the ones who have rabies are the ones you're going to find on the ground. And so you have to be very careful. Never touch a bat that you can touch. Because if you can touch a bat, it's probably one of the sick ones. So now we have 2 on the property. We call them our bat rescue kits. It's roughly a shoebox, a plastic spatula, and a heavy glove. So if you find a bat down on the ground, this is how you can get it. If it's a baby bat, we will actually go all the way up on the roof and put it back in the bat house. But if it's an adult bat, I can call Laura. I mean, she's been known to come all the way up from Osteen to get this bat. That's a Florida Wild. I think we'll also take them once in a while if they're, So it's been quite an adventure.
Tell us about the development of Artisan Alley. How did that happen? Was it a slow process, or tell us about the beginnings?
Yeah, so, well, like I said, the place was a mess when we first took over, and largely empty. It was like a ghost town. On August 30th, 2006, I was in the Beacon working, and one of the employees came running in from taking out the trash. And he said, Barb, I think there's a fire. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, just always something. So I went out, and sure enough, there was smoke coming from underneath one of the garage doors on the row of one-story buildings we now call Artisan Alley. Bake Chop is there, and Nest, and that row. Blake Elliott called the fire department, and sure enough, there was a fire, and it had inside that garage space, it had quite a chance to get going before the fire department could get there and start work on it. So that caused the particular unit where the fire started was rented by 3 bands, and I can only remember the name of one. I think it was Coyotes and Town Dogs, and they used it as rehearsal space, and that's where the fire started. So let's see, where was I? So the fire caused about $400,000 worth of damage. at the end of the day. And actually, it was the insurance money from that incident. I didn't set the fire. They never really figured out what caused the fire. They said officially, I think, that it was of unknown electrical origin. Well, you can imagine, with 3 bands rehearsing in a 100-year-old space, something's plugged in or there's an equipment that sparks, who knows. But it was a different time of insurance because the insurance company was fabulous. They paid everything they owed and took care of that. And so now I'm sitting on roughly $400,000, which, after struggling along month to month and trying to make ends meet at the Conrad for 2 years, suddenly I had a bunch of money. And I had no idea what to do with it. So I just put it in the bank and enjoyed looking at the bank balance every month. I had no idea what to do. And then in August, let me get the date right here. So 2006, 7, in August roughly of 2008, somebody happened to mention to me that if I didn't spend that money within 2 years, it would become taxable. So now I've got from sometime in August till December 31st to spend all that money. And I recruited, who's now a good friend, Ken Goldberg, construction company. And we said, what can we do? And we made a plan. And I actually had brought pieces of poster board and made a calendar on them, what we had to do every single day to get all that money spent by December 31st. And what we planned was Artisan Alley. And they were simple finishes, rustic, places where we thought artisans could work. Every unit had a shower because that seemed to make sense. And sure enough, it worked. It didn't work out exactly. We don't exactly have artisans per se there. In the one unit we actually have the DeLand Art and Metal, formerly known as the Florida Society of Goldsmiths, and they are actually in there making very beautiful jewelry. But now we also have a restaurant, Bake Shop, and Nest, and a beauty salon with boutique, Blake Elliott. So that's how it happened. It actually, Artisan Alley would not have come about as quickly as it did without the tragedy of that fire, which nobody got hurt, and pretty much all the stuff, even the musical instruments, was covered by the tenant's insurance. So if you're going to have a big old fire like that, it was, good in that way. And it was a beautiful spirit of everybody coming together. We ended up tearing down the middle units where the fire had started, that were the most badly damaged.
And that's where the vacant space is
And
now?
that's where the parking lot is today, and our recycling dumpsters, which we're very proud of. We do a lot of recycling over there on the Conrad property. That's where it began. And then rented the spaces to some beautiful people. We had a belly dance studio to begin with over there, but eventually rented the Nest space to Terry and Rob Peden, who started, they called it the Fourth Friday, and they would recruit artisans and craftspeople to set up in tents on the property, and it was very popular, and people loved to come down and shop. And so this was our Fourth Friday event, started by Terry and Rob and managed by them. And then somebody said, well, what we really need is a farmer's market. So then we found Neezy Nyland and Pauline Capello, and they brought farmers into the mix, and we thought, we need to have this every Friday. So it became the Artisan Alley Farmers and Makers Market, which now is a very popular event. And every Friday night, we have had, and I always lose track, and I can't remember them all, but I can remember some. But I know we've had 7 farmers market vendors become brick and mortar businesses in downtown DeLand. And of all the things we've done, I am so proud of that, because that is true economic development from the ground up. That's the way it really happens. So I know one of them's Trilogy Coffee. One of them is our Indian food restaurant, Parvathi's Kitchen, that is on the as a tenant on the Conrad today. So it's been quite a good story.
That, in perspective, the Artisan Alley, what contribution do you think that has made to the character of DeLand?
That's a really big question. I would say one thing it has done was downtown DeLand is a delightful place, and long before we ever had the Friday night event, but there wasn't so much a gathering spot. And that's what happens on Friday night, is people gather there and they can sit and relax and have dinner, have a beverage, and get to know one another and see one another's dogs. I mean, the number of dogs that come to that event, and rarely a dog fight. Anyway, it's a gathering place for the community to come together. And, it got people off the main drag to see some of the other spots that make up downtown DeLand. So I think that's probably been its most important contribution. And then I've been so blessed. I haven't counted them recently, but we have beautiful murals on the property as well. So if they come down on Artisan Alley, they see those things and they see the beauty that we've tried to create. So
back to the journalism aspects of the Beacon. What are some of the big stories that you can recall?
I should have told you not to ask me very many memory questions. Okay. One of the biggest stories that we ever did, and that I'm most proud of, some viewers will remember when a homeless man killed a homeless woman on Woodland Boulevard in front of the Bank of America building. He stabbed her to death and then dripped blood all the way back to the 7-Eleven, where he took a seat and more or less waited for the cops to come. And they did. But we were able to figure out the story behind that story and really portray what it's like to be suffering from a mental illness and to consequently be homeless. In both cases of both of these people, they had very loving families that were very attentive. But when you have a family member who has schizophrenia, without resources to really help, there's very little you can do, even though you want to and you try. And so that story, and I believe we chose the headline, "Blood on the Boulevard and on Our Hands?" ? So that's one of the biggies in my book. And we have consistently covered the development projects, whether the county council, Deltona, DeLand, Orange City, that people are so interested in, because I think West Volusia is really becoming aware that we've got a growth problem, and that if we don't get some sort of handle on it, we're going to lose what's special about our area here.
And define what you think is special about this area.
Well, sometimes I say that the Beacon exists to convince people that we're still a small town. But it's that. It's but it's changing. It's the fact that you can drive to the grocery store in 15 minutes instead of 45 because of traffic. It's the fact that there are organizations like the West Volusia Historical Society who can provide that connection, that we're small enough that if a person gets involved with your organization, for example, the Historical Society, you can truly make a difference we're just that small, and that smallness is what makes the difference, I think. And then, of course, as big as we are, you always want to be creating, whether it's the audience of the Beacon or the people who patronize the Friday night market. You want to create these little circles and communities that, and then you want to have a local newspaper that can knit all that together for people. So,
which obviously the Beacon has had some success at doing.
I believe so, sure. Yeah, nowadays, a lot of people think that they just need social media. And if they're having a half-price sale on whatever it is, they'll just make a Facebook post, and that's all. That might reach 25 people, depending on your social media skills. Whereas the local newspaper brings in so many more, and people who aren't your friends, which is what you really want, to get the word out to people.
So, in terms of legacy, what would you say your legacy has been?
Oh, gosh. Do I have to have a legacy? Doesn't that mean I have to, die?
That is a question
thanks.
I'm required to ask.
Yeah. No, of course. I appreciate that. And it's something probably we should all think about. I hope that in everything I've done, I have done it with love. And I mean, not romantic love, but that larger love that is us reflecting what I believe to be God. That I hope I was unselfish, and I'm pretty sure I have, because I didn't get rich, but I hope I left the community richer for having a local paper and having the Conrad property restored.
If you were to meet an enterprising young woman who wanted to do something different, what would be your advice to that person?
Well, go for it, but do keep in mind what that guy at the SBA seminar said. This is going to be your life, 24/7. And also, have a vision. Visualize what it could be. And then convince yourself that that's where you're going. Always expect success, I think.
That's a big one.
Well, anything else puts you in sort of a rotten mood for getting things done.
One of the things that we haven't touched on is your partnership with Jeff. And I know he's a VIP in your life.
Yes.
And he did get to become a saxophonist.
He did. And now at 68, he has more gigs than gig offers, the requests for him to play, than he really can accept. So that worked out well. And he, along the way, worked for 33 years at the Florida Department of Transportation, which was a good thing for our family because somebody had to make some kind of money. And he's also the father of our two daughters, Anna Collins, who lives in Orlando with our three grandchildren, and Ella Shepherd, who moved back to DeLand, much to our delight, and is a mental health counselor and yoga teacher with practices here. So, yes, Jeff and I have been married. This coming November will be 25 years. I'm sorry, 45 years. Maybe even I can't believe it. So for, two kids, I want to tell you why we got married, if we still have time. So when we landed in DeLand and had no money, and I had my job at the Sun News, and he got on at RAF Magnetics, at the Sun News, I met a colleague, Vicki Brown, and we became friends. And she mentioned that her grandmother, Sarah Hargraves Brown, who lived at, I think it was 213 West New York Avenue, in a very fine home right next door to the Hotel Putnam, needed live-in companions. Well, we needed a place to live, and we thought we could do pretty good taking care of an older person. So we moved in and took care of Sarah Hargraves Brown, and the family felt that the matriarch, Sarah, wouldn't be happy about the fact that Jeff and I really weren't married. So they felt it right that we should pretend we were married. And Jeff and I went to a pawn shop and got a little wedding band. And for 1 week, we pretended we were married. We're just not comfortable with dishonesty. And it wore on us. And we said, why don't we just get married? So a couple weeks later, in Lake Helen at the First Congregational Church, we did. And at a very small wedding, Dick and Irene Dickinson, he was the pastor of the church, had become wonderful friends, and he married us, and it worked. And 45 years later, here we are. So that's, I've written on many wedding cards, when I give a gift when somebody's getting married, there will be times that you love the relationship more than you love the person. Because somebody told me that when we were getting married. And boy, that's true. And you've just got to kind of weather those times and grow together and best you can. And so here we are. Yeah, Jeff is a wonderful guy. I mean, he currently puts on 2 jazz shows a month, free to the community on the Artisan Alley property, and then is part of putting on a 3rd free jazz show at Cafe Da Vinci once a month. So he loves jazz and loves the heritage and the history, and he's also been for the last, I think it's 12 years, the producer of the Thin Man Watts Jazz Festival in DeLand, which is, an event, of course, honors the Thin Man, Dr. Noble Watts, who grew up here in DeLand and had international fame, really, as a saxophone player. So.
How do you see Thin Man Watts? Obviously, that is he's from the Black community, or was from the Black community here. How do you see race relations in DeLand?
Well, I've seen a lot of progress in that area. In fact, when we started the jazz festival, the concept was that there would be shows at Cafe Da Vinci, right downtown on George Avenue, and shows at the African American, the amphitheater, Noble Watts Amphitheater, over on Clara Avenue in Spring Hill or Black area, whatever you want to say. We thought it was important, and indeed it was, because at that time, you would rarely see a patron of color at Cafe Da Vinci, for example, and very few white people attending events at the amphitheater. So we thought, what about an event that brings everybody together through a love for jazz and gets people into each other's neighborhoods? And indeed, the first year of the festival, one of my friends, who was white, said to me, I'm not sure about going over there to that amphitheater. She'd never been and ordinarily wouldn't have tried it because it was scary to her. And I'm sure the people of color who were coming to Cafe Da Vinci felt similarly. Not that many years ago, people of color commonly said they weren't comfortable in downtown DeLand because of the way they were treated. And I see that easing. And I do see more people of color. I am so proud. Let me count real quick. I'm sure I'm leaving somebody out. The Conrad Realty property is currently home to 4 businesses owned by people of color. And that is really different because there were no Black-owned businesses in downtown DeLand to speak of. But it's been just wonderful changes. Of course, we're not finished. We are not finished. There is still racism here. And sometimes it's very ugly and very obvious. And I worry in our current political situation that it is being almost approved or encouraged. But we're not gonna let that happen. We're not gonna backslide. And I'm proud of what DeLand, both in the bringing together of the communities of color with the rest of white DeLand. I'm proud of our progress there, and I'm proud of our embrace of the LGBTQ community. I think we've made remarkable strides over the past, even just the past 10 years. We've made remarkable strides in those two areas. So I think DeLand's on the right track.
What about Main Street DeLand? What role has that played that you've observed?
You mean the Main Street DeLand Association, the actual, well, they got the ball rolling. And no, they got the ball rolling. They kept us all focused. I think they probably, their existence in a support role for downtown businesses and property owners probably encouraged investment in downtown real estate. They brought events, which think Tropical Nights, for example, that brought the community out and brought the community together and helped support the businesses. The events are very important economically to the downtown DeLand business. It's rough to make it as a little retailer in downtown, anywhere probably, but downtown DeLand. I hate to admit that I think the growth, the development of the Victoria Park area, for example, has been important in helping us support these small businesses in downtown DeLand. So some growth is good, but we're done, we're full. So we've got to work that out.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have, or any final comment you'd like to make?
Oh, just that I am, and Jeff is too, I know, very grateful for the opportunities we've had here, for the support we've had in our endeavors. And our daughter named her business Ella's Endeavors, so I like that word, for our endeavors here in DeLand in all the ways. And I've got to say, the taking care of Sarah Hargraves Brown was the start of a wonderful friendship. This is our auxiliary family. Dot Brown, her daughter Sarah Brown, they're here in DeLand, and their family has been so instrumental in everything that we've done. So we're just very grateful, but not just the Browns. So many people have helped us, and we try to help young people when we can too, in the same way.